Hey guys, welcome back. How did you like episode 3? I actually loved it. So, I had not really seen very many spoilers that came out of this episode. I'd seen, mostly they came from 4 and 6, the ones that I've seen, and so I wasn't really sure what to expect from episode 3. And I didn't expect anything big to happen, because I figured, if it had, then that would have been put out there as a spoiler clip, but I just wasn't sure exactly what would happen. But I ended up really loving it. There's a lot that I have to go over today, and anyway, yeah, I just really, really love this episode. So, I guess this is where I say we are going to have spoilers for episode 3. I'm going to talk all about it here, so if you haven't watched or don't want to hear, then go watch first and then come back and listen. So, probably the first thing that I noticed, and this was even before the episode started, is in the recap, they didn't have the kiss between Daryl and Isabelle, and I just thought that was kind of interesting. Usually what they put in the recap informs what's going to be in the episode, so I just figured they wouldn't be really spending any time on their relationship in this episode. And that wouldn't be surprising if it was like a really action-packed episode, right? So I just figured that's what it would be. But then they actually did. They have a really important scene in this episode that's kind of all about them and their relationship. So I think it's an interesting choice that they didn't put the kiss in the recap. And I think that is purposeful, and I think it does say something about where the relationship is or isn't going, which, we already know that. We know that Isabelle's going to die before the end of the season. But it's just interesting. I seem to... I'm not positive, though. I seem to remember them putting Jesse and Rick's kiss in a recap once they got to 609, which is where Jesse dies. So it's interesting that they didn't do it here. It might just be because everyone's been so sensitive about it. The fandom's been melting down a little bit. I don't know, but I just noted that. I thought it was interesting. Okay, so let's dive into the episode. The first thing, of course, that we see is some scenes from the Louvre. Now, we've been waiting for these scenes to see what they would bring to us. In terms of what happens, obviously, this is a younger Genet, and she's working there as a janitor. And I think this is interesting because they do this so often. They take someone who is a major leader in some way in the show and show that before they were not that big a leader, right? She was the janitorial staff. She was not like the museum curator or anything like that. And this is kind of something that the show does, and I like it that they do this. It always makes it really, really interesting. So this is just us seeing, kind of Genet's experience of the change, the turn, when the virus hit. It's also interesting that her right-hand gal, that's her kind of first-in-command soldier, was also working there. And between the two of them, that lady who, I finally figured out her name, it's Sabine. Sabine was way more of a leader and way more dominant at that point than Genet was. And obviously the tables have turned at this point, but it was just, the whole thing was just really, really interesting. They were getting ready to stage a walkout for a labor protest, and there's a lot going on, but of course that never happened. In a way, I almost thought it was ironic because they were going to stage a walkout and then they got locked in. But the bottom line is that Genet, unfortunately, sees her husband get killed. He's trying to get to her, and she's trying to get to him, and they're on opposite sides of the pyramid and can't actually get to each other because there's a wall there. And then she sees him get bitten. And, of course, that... They talk about in the episode Insider, which is at the very end, that this was the genesis of Genet's character, as her losing her husband this way. And I'll talk more about that when we get to that part. But it was very interesting. Now, here's the thing. In terms of the Louvre symbolism, there's both less than I thought there would be and also more. In the sense of... there wasn't anything like massive staring you in the face about the symbolism, but I think what we did see is very, very potent. I mean, if nothing else, and this is a very high-level view, we have a representation of Genet losing the love of her life. So there is definitely a romance relationship kind of thing going on here. We see her lose the person she was in love with. Now, I'm not going to go really, really heavy into all of the symbolism around the Louvre that we have theorized and talked about in the past. We've gone over, it mostly ties to Mary Magdalene symbolism and very much to the Da Vinci Code, which also revolves around the Louvre, right? And people have done many, many, many metas on that. I will go back and try to find any that I have done and link them in the show notes. But I also think that there are other people who are more of an authority on this particular symbolism than I am, who have just talked about it more than I have and investigated it more than I have. But the very, very brief explanation of it is that we have linked, because Beth is the Christ figure, we link the Mary Magdalene symbolism to Daryl. And because of the Da Vinci Code, the Louvre is very much linked to that. And we know that Gimple is a fan of the Da Vinci Code. So we do believe he's pulling symbolism from there. So now we have this, representation of somebody losing the love of their life, which is probably, people are going to say that it's a foreshadow of Isabelle dying, and I think it is, but at the same time, I think it's more so a representation of Beth and what happened before, especially because we've seen symbolism that's similar to this in the past, long before Daryl met Isabelle. And then there's the Mona Lisa. I think it's really, really interesting what they say about her. They talk about how, there's a secret in that smile and she's hiding something. And they really emphasize that because, after seeing the first part with Genet, it fades into Carol looking at the Mona Lisa and Genet comes to talk to her. And Genet says that there's a secret in that smile, something withheld. And again, inside the episode at the end, Isabelle, the showrunner, talks about how this is very much informing Genet's character. She became someone who is hiding something, someone who is withholding the truth and being deceptive about things. And that's actually very interesting, like even just that alone. We kind of knew that about Genet already, but it also, because there's so many parallels between Genet's operation and Grady, it just goes to show that there were secrets there. There's things that are being withheld. I believe this is even though they're talking about Genet here, symbolically, it's being tied to Grady and things that were going on there that we didn't understand. So I think this is the writers telling us, you got to look at this. There's something secret going on. There's something being withheld here that we don't see. So there's that. So if you look at that as a whole, we have the Mary Magdalene symbolism through the Louvre. We have somebody losing the person that they're in love with. And then we have a secret and something being withheld about that. You see what I mean? So there wasn't any really hitting you in the face Beth symbolism there. And what I mean by that is there was there wasn't anything green in particular. I'm sure there was green stuff there, but you know what I mean? But what is there, and when you see it all together, is actually very, very, very potent. So I enjoyed looking at that, and I'm absolutely positive that we will find a lot more detail about that, and there's going to be other people who write whole metas about this one scene and how the symbolism is all incorporated, and more power to them. If anything in particular comes up that I want to talk about, I will. But for at least today, I'm just going to kind of keep going with the episode. But I really, really liked that scene. I thought it was super, super interesting. Oh, the other detail is that when she was a janitor, right? And so somebody spilled a drink and she had to go mop it up. They didn't show us the mop, like a really great shot of the mop she was using, but it reminded me of Daryl using the mop when he was with the Saviors. And we also saw Beth using a mop at Grady. So again, just another way to link the three. And I don't know, maybe they showed us the mop. I guess I would have to go back and look. I didn't think they actually gave us a shot of it. But the thing is, chances are it's not going to be that signature yellow mop that we saw with Beth and Daryl, because this is in France. And it would be really weird if their mops looked exactly like ours do in the States. And maybe that's why they didn't focus on it, because it wouldn't have been much of a visual parallel. But in terms of what they were doing, it was definitely similar. The other thing, now that I'm thinking of it, because she was mopping, that kind of puts her in the same role as Beth and Daryl when they were both, captured in their various places, meaning they were sort of the lowest social class there. They were like the serving people, the janitors, whatever you want to call it. And then Genet rose to leadership, right? And you could definitely say Daryl did too. He ended up for a very short time actually being the leader at the Savior compound, which didn't actually last that long. He was pretty miserable there. But to me, it's just another way to show that Beth, where she was at Grady, and then she too will rise to be a leader, and they're just paralleling these things, right? More callbacks. All right, so then we go to Carol, and she speaks with Genet. And then there's this really kind of strange sequence where there's a guy that gets really surly about the food not tasting good, and he throws it on the floor, and Genet makes him eat it off the floor. And when I was watching that, I was trying to figure out what the point of that was. Originally, especially because the guy, it seemed a little bit almost forced. I almost wonder if Genet set that up. And they didn't tell us that she did at any point, but if the guy is surly enough to throw the food on the floor like that, you would think he would have put up a little bit more resistance when this tiny little woman comes up and starts ordering him around. But he didn't. He immediately did what she said and started eating it off the floor. So I kind of half wondered if maybe she had set that up because all of these people, like Carol, are new, and she's like trying to make a point about how things work here. I don't know if that's true. Like I said, they didn't show us that that's true. It also could be that they were just trying to say that Genet has such a presence that he immediately backed down. And I do think that it was a foreshadow of the ending. So there's that as well. But it was kind of interesting, and it just seemed a little bit random to me at the time. I did love Carol's reaction to it, though, because even though Genet after that comes back to her and is very positive and is going, oh, welcome to the Maison Mère, you just see Carol's like frown, like her brow creases, and she's going, yeah, something's off here. You know? She's already sensing that there's something a little bit twisted about Genet. So then we see her talking to Remy, which is the guy she met on the truck who speaks English. And she's, you know, still trying to find Daryl, and he's trying to find his husband. And she is assigned to the kitchen, and he's assigned to the stables. And there's actually quite a few lines in here that are pretty funny. Throughout the whole episode, I laughed several times. He asked if Daryl liked horses, and she said only the steel kind, and Remy didn't understand that. But it's okay. I could go all kinds of places with that line, and I don't want to spend 10 minutes on every single line here, but you could relate this to so many things. First of all, it's kind of funny, right? Because she's talking about his bike. But the bike, people have said, is a symbol of Beth in some ways. And then there's the horse symbolism, right? And this is also a foreshadow of Carol riding the horse. And I even thought about, completely outside the show, nothing to do with this, Norman has said before that he is a little bit afraid of horses. And so I thought it even might be a little bit of a tease on that. Anyway, there's just like so many layers to every single line they have. But she and Remy, Carol and Remy, they go into this tunnel. And remember I said I was interested in what happens with the tunnel? So we're going to have another tunnel in season 6 that Daryl and Carol will be in. But actually seeing this tunnel was interesting because it led to where they were doing experiments. And Carol has actually seen these firsthand now, that they put people against a wall, fire squatted them, you know, killed them all, and then injected them with the same compound that, you know, Daryl has seen this compound in season 1. He fought one of the walkers that had been juiced up with this thing. And so she's seen that. So in a way, you could say here, this tunnel did lead to death. On the other side of it, they were killing people and letting them turn and doing these experiments, and that is what the tunnel leads to. Now, the interesting thing about that is that we did see some tunnel symbolism at Grady, and in a way, that sort of confirms that there might have been experiments going on at Grady. So I just kind of went, that's interesting. I hadn't really thought of it that way before, as the tunnel specifically leading, I mean, the tunnel leading to death is kind of obvious, but tunnel leading to experiments, I hadn't really thought of that before. So just something to kind of think about and keep an eye on. But of course, somebody finds them, tells them to go away, and they do. And she tells Remy that she's going to go poke around and she'll come find him. So then we go back to the nest and we see Sylvie praying. And I actually misread this at first. She's praying for to be able to save, quote unquote, him. And I just assumed that she was praying for Emile, and she does not know that he is dead or that he betrayed them. But she actually isn't. She's praying to be able to save Laurent. And then when a guard comes to give her food, she breaks out and starts shouting and telling everyone that they're going to kill Laurent. And when they try to get a hold of her, she gets thrown from a higher place. I'm not sure what it was, a parapet maybe, and unfortunately dies. And that was surprising to me that she died. I wasn't expecting that. And then I just kind of wanted to smack Lo Sang. He said her faith was weak. Like, okay, I'm sorry. Whose faith was weak? So then we see, once the tide goes out, Daryl and Isabelle trying to get back into the nest with Falou, but they're trying to sneak in. they talk about Ohio and whether she would like it, and Daryl talks about the summer, and he mentions fireflies. And the only reason that caught my attention is that I have seen a later scene where they talk about fireflies, and it was obvious because I only saw the snippet that they were going to have a conversation about that at some point. I was like, all right, well, this is in response to some conversation they had earlier. So I was kind of waiting to see the conversation about the fireflies, and we did get it here. They do find a way in. Losang gives Laurent tea to relax him. He drugs him, basically. And then we get to the ceremony, and Laurent is just kind of almost like he's been roofied a little bit, and he's just not, he's a little bit out of it, right? The flags in the ceremony did catch my attention. There's a whole bunch of them, but we see one that's like a flame with fire. We see a yin-yang one, and there also, the main one is like a phoenix with a rising sun. So all of those are interesting symbolism, right? And then they bring the walker out to bite Laurent, and it is Sylvie. And that's, yeah, whew, that's twisted. Very interesting, but very twisted. Of course, Daryl saves the day. He shoots Walker, Sylvie, and Falou and Isabelle get Laurent, and there's all sorts of chaos and all of that. So that was a really fun scene. And one thing I noticed is that when they all came back together, you know, Daryl goes and finds them, so the four of them are all together, and they're hiding and trying to get out. It occurred to me that we don't actually see Daryl hug Laurent, and people would probably expect that. I mean, when Daryl got back at the beginning of the last episode, Laurent ran down and hugged him, and if anything, Laurent isn't doing that because he's still pretty out of it, but you would almost expect Daryl to hug him, and we don't see that. And the reason that sort of, I noted that, and it occurred to me, is because a lot of people said that about Beth and Daryl in Coda. Like, why didn't they hug? And I think that this very much may be a parallel, but it's also just very common logic. I mean, whenever we would have people who didn't, you know, the people that didn't think there was anything romantic there between Beth and Daryl, and they would use that as an excuse. Well, if it was romantic, why didn't he hug her in the hallway? And, you know, of course, it's a terrible, ridiculous excuse. But, you know, what we would always say is like, well, there's a lot going on. They're trying to survive. Like, there's a lot of tension in the air. There's time for that later. Right now, they're just trying to get everyone out alive, and unfortunately, that did not go well in Coda. And it's kind of the same thing here. So it's just your basic, let's be reasonable about this, but it occurred to me that it might be a little bit of a parallel there. So he tells the three of them to go hide, and he's going to have Laurent take them to a particular cave that he and Laurent had trained in, and he's going to follow in a day or so. This is where we get our first really massive, really obvious alone replay. I almost said still replay, but it would actually be an alone replay. And I went through and watched this several times to make sure that I wasn't just seeing things, and trust me, I'm not. So Isabelle and Falou and Laurent go one way, and Daryl goes another way. He kills one particular dude, and he throws his arrows down, and I thought that was a little bit odd, that he not only threw his arrows away, so he doesn't have those as a weapon anymore, but it made a really big deal, like an obvious shot of him throwing the arrows down on top of the guy. And I was going, okay, that was weird. And I actually stopped it. I was thinking there might be 8 arrows. I'm actually only counting 7, but it's really hard to tell because the shot is very quick, and when I pause it, the arrows are still like falling, so it's a little bit blurry. It's hard to see how many, but there's 7 or 8 arrows that he throws down there. Now, why do I care about the number of arrows? Because I was thinking of the alone parallel. So let me explain what it is if other people did not pick up on it. First of all, he tells them to go down to this cave, which is nearby, and he will get there in a day or 2. That is the equivalent of him saying, go down the road a bit and I'll meet you there, to Beth. Okay, then we see him, like I said, he kills the first guy and he throws the arrows down, so he doesn't have the bow and arrow anymore. Then we see him run into this dark place. I'm almost going to call it the basement of the nest. I don't know if it actually is the basement, but it's a dark enclosed area that's shadowed, you know, not like open to the sky. And what made me first realize it is he runs to one wall and then kind of spins around because there's not a way to get out there. They very much paralleled this almost blow by blow with what happens in Alone when he tells Beth to go, and then he leads the walkers into the basement. He gets down into the basement, and then he spins around to look back at the way he came because he realizes there's not an out there. So I'm going to show you during this part some parallel shots that I took as best I could. When there's a lot of action and Daryl's fighting, it's hard to get clean screenshots because there's so much movement, but I'll do the best I can. But some of the ways in which he fights the people look very similar to Still, and at the end, just before he runs back up the stairs, he stops and pulls a knife out of some guy's head. In Alone, I'm sorry, I keep saying Still. In Alone, I want to say it was one of his arrows, not a knife, but he still stops and pulls it out of the zombie's head before he runs back up the stairs. So the major difference is that here he's killing alive people, not walkers. And obviously in Alone it was walkers. But other than that, they paralleled the two sequences really, really closely. And actually once he comes up to the top of the stairs, he does actually kill one more guy. And I think that parallels the one walker he kills once he gets out into the yard in Alone. So this was definitely an intentional pairing. And it's one that I went through several times just to make sure. But yeah, that's totally on purpose. I keep saying that they're replaying a lot of season 4, and this was definitely that. And that's why I was thinking that the arrows that he dropped, there might be 8 of them, because when Daryl goes down into the basement in season 4, when he's leading the walkers down there are 8 pairs of scissors lined up on the little medical tray, down there. And like I said, I don't know if there's actually 8 arrows. It was hard to tell. I also tried to count the number of people he killed. Again, it was it was really hard because everything's happening so fast, and then there are several times that he knocks people down, and sometimes he kills them the first time they go down, and then other times he knocks them down, fights somebody else, and then turns around and that person has jumped back up, and so he fights them again. So it's really hard to get an accurate count. I think it's at least 10 people that he kills, but anyway. So that was really interesting, and that definitely jumped out at me as a parallel sequence. So then, of course, he ends up getting taken hostage. He doesn't get away, but Isabelle gets stuck behind a door. They're trying to sneak away under the nose of a guard, and so Falou gets by, and then Laurent gets by, but then before she can, there's other people coming, so she has to hide, and then they just the guards sort of decided to chill right there where she is, and so she couldn't get out. And so Falou takes Laurent and leaves, but she's stuck behind this door. And this, again, definitely seems like a parallel, and like there's a lot of symbolism here. We don't actually see her be found throughout the whole episode. We don't see where she's found and taken. And that's interesting that they just kind of didn't show us that. And part of it was for the sake of the scene where we do see her again and she gets chained up next to Daryl. But I feel like there's a lot of Beth symbolism here. Like, think of it this way. I mean, you could on the one hand parallel it to what happens in Alone. It's still a little bit different though, because in that case, Daryl was not taken hostage in Alone. But if we're thinking about Beth was taken by the cops, the Grady cops, right? And she was put in their car. And you could kind of see a parallel here with Isabelle being kind of hidden away in a closet. And obviously then she was taken. And so the point is she wasn't able to get away. But I also think that it could be a parallel to how Beth survived, instead of anyone seeing her die or seeing her escape. It just seems like she was hidden there somewhere. And Daryl is sitting here thinking she got away with Falou and Laurent, or hoping she did, and he doesn't know any better until he actually sees her. But the point is, she didn't get away. She was still there somewhere. Which also goes back to a theory that I've had for a long time, that during the missing 17 days when they can't find Beth's body, she was probably taken back to Grady. We have more than one sequence that suggests that. The other one is with Glenn back in season 4. Maggie's looking for him away from the prison, and it's like it doesn't occur to her that he might be back at the prison, because why would it? She thought that he left on the bus. And you can kind of see how that's similar here too. Daryl thought Isabelle left with Laurent and Falou, but she's still there, and he wouldn't have probably, if he had gotten away, he didn't, but he wouldn't have thought that she was still there because he told them to leave. So he wouldn't have thought to go back looking for her until and unless he found Falou and was told she never showed up. You see what I mean? So it's just kind of, they're using sort of similar sequences there too. All right, so then it goes back to Carol. We see her sneaking around, and she's asking if anybody knows Daryl or has seen Daryl, but most of them don't speak English. And then she hears Codron speaking about him, and he's been tortured and beaten, so he's pretty delirious. But this is where she tells him that Daryl is her brother. And, it's funny because, the certain ships were so up in arms about that. And honestly, it's not even what I thought it was. Like, she's not in the show even necessarily, like, making a statement about her and Daryl's relationship. She's literally lying to Codron so that he will tell her where Daryl is. I mean, when she says that, I honestly think she's trying to say that her and Daryl are actual, like, blood brother and sister, but it's because she's trying to get Codron to help her. So it's not even really a statement about their relationship. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that's not the case or, like, trying to debunk it or anything, but I just think it's funny that people were flipping out about it and saying that it was a statement about whether the two of them are romantic or not, which, yes, it still is because they are not. But it's just different than I thought it would be. And, I mean, personally, I think that their relationship, the truth of Daryl and Carol's relationship, is really portrayed more as mother-son than brother-sister. And maybe it doesn't matter because either way it's a familial relationship. But anyway, just like a random note on that. I just thought it was interesting because what she's doing when she says that to Codron is different than what I thought it would be. So just kind of interesting. And then here's the other interesting thing. It starts here and then it continues later with her scene with Genet, is that Carol is actually the one being really hopeful here. And I thought it was a little bit strange and interesting to be hearing the hope from Carol, because usually that is not her functionality in the story. She tells Codron, I don't believe in coincidence. There's a reason I found you. It's a sign. And he says, I don't believe in signs. So between the two of them, Carol's being like Beth here. Like, she's being very hopeful. And, again, she is 100% trying to get him to talk to her and tell her stuff. But it's still interesting because we hear this from her several times in the episode. And this is unlike Carol to be using this kind of this lingo about hopefulness and faith, You could argue that it's a mask because, we remember back in season 6 when she pretended to be a sweet grandma lady, and really it was just all a ruse. But I don't know. In this case, I actually think there's more to it. I mean, it's one of these things where even Carol might think it's a ruse, but I don't think it is because she's looking at what's going on around her. She's looking at the twistedness of Genet's operation, and that is pushing her more toward her own decency because she does not believe in handling things that way, right? And so she's making herself at odds with Genet and being the opposite of her. So it's just kind of interesting to see. The other thing we could say about the sign, it's a sign, and Codron saying, I don't believe in signs, is that it is a callback to the signs are all there. You just got to know how to read them. So there's that as well. He does end up telling her about the nest, and then she goes to talk to Remy to find out where it is and how to get there, and he does tell her how. She asks him to come with her. He says no because he needs to find Julian. All right, so then we have Daryl waking up at the nest. Lo Sang is there. It's obvious that Daryl's been beaten pretty badly. You could call this a lot like Beth waking up in the hospital. I don't know. Like, that's a little bit weak in my opinion, just because, yes, he is waking up somewhere, but he already knows where he is, and he's already been beaten. And I don't know. If anything, this might be more of a parallel to Beth waking up after she's shot, but I don't know. Even that, so-so on that. This part, though, was really interesting. I mean, I think the thing about this episode is, like, what they're saying, their conversations, and what those conversations are revealing about the characters and their motivations and their beliefs are just really, really interesting. I thought this episode was so well written. So Lo Sang then, in his very calm way, and it's, at the beginning, when Lo Sang seems genuine, you really like him. And the fact that he's calm, he's got, outwardly anyway, kind of a Herschel quality to him, and that he's a spiritual leader, and he's very calm, and he's very kind to everyone. But once he starts being kind of passive-aggressive like this, you just kind of want to punch him in the face. He starts to accuse Daryl of some interesting things. He says that it must be hard living without any semblance of faith. And that Daryl only lives for himself. And then Lo Sang says, but meaning him, himself, he has dedicated himself to protecting a community. And it's really ironic that he's accusing Daryl of all of these things. I mean, of course, we could talk about the faith aspect and how Beth was all about faith, and this is definitely a callback to her. But the thing is, none of what he says about Daryl is true. It's an assumption that Lo Sang is making, and it's a really arrogant assumption. Ever since Beth, I mean, Daryl has had his dark points, obviously, but people don't understand that even, I mean, really what Lo Sang is talking about here is apparently if you don't have religion, and obviously if you don't agree with me, then you don't have faith. But there's a lot of different kinds of faith. And Daryl just trying to get back to his family, that's a form of faith. He's got faith that they're still going to be there, that they're wanting him to come home, and that he's going to be able to get home to them. I mean, all of those things are faith. And Daryl does not live for himself. Daryl lives for everybody. And Daryl did dedicate himself to a community, to Alexandria, and then to the Commonwealth. You know what I mean? Like, Lo Sang saying all these things, and Daryl doesn't fight back. He doesn't, yell at him that he's an idiot, and none of the things Lo Sang are saying are true. But it's just interesting because it's very ironic. Lo Sang doesn't realize that everything he's saying is the opposite of the truth about Daryl, And so it's interesting just to watch Daryl sit there and listen to Lo Sang say these things. Then he says, only by risking everything can we find the true meaning of faith. And then the really, really telling thing is just right at the end of this conversation, Daryl says, well, what if you're wrong? What if, what if Laurent didn't survive the bite? And Lo Sang says that if he's wrong, there would be no point in going on. So this is how you know that on the inside, Lo Sang is pretty much a cult leader. I mean, he's willing to either kill or at least let his people die if he decides there's no reason to go on. And that's really frightening. He's actually really scary, even though he doesn't come across that way on the outside. So then we see Carol trying to escape the Maison Mère. She knocks out a guard. She tries to take a car, but can't figure that out, so then she decides to take the horse instead. She's not great with horses, but she does figure out. She gets it to go, and then, of course, she's stopped by Sabine and her guards. It turns out Remy told on her so that he could get, secure his and his husband's freedom, which is unfortunate, but we've seen this, and what occurred to me at this point is that in these sequences, there's always a betrayal. So, of course, going back to Slabtown, we've said many times that this whole thing with Genet and her operation is quite a bit like Dawn and Grady, and we had Edwards betraying him there, or betraying her, and now we have Remy betraying Carol. I mean, it just seems like whenever we get a Grady-like sequence, there's always a betrayal of some kind. So just kind of interesting, and another way to parallel. But this scene, in any other episode, this scene where Carol talks to Genet in her office might have been my favorite in the whole episode, but the problem is this episode was full of really, really good scenes that had lots of good stuff in them. I mean, there's the one I just talked about where Lo Sang is saying all of that to Daryl. I thought that was a really fascinating scene. Then we have this one, and then we have the one with Daryl and Isabelle, all of which were just really, really good. But in this case, this is classic Carol, and I absolutely loved this scene. She sits down to talk to Genet, and Genet says, okay, no more lies. Where did you come from? And Carol tells her the unmitigated truth. And you got to wonder what's going through Carol's mind at that point. But I would say she just recognized, well, number one, Carol's really intelligent and she does know how to manipulate people. So I think she recognized that lying here was not going to serve her. And the best way to get Genet to trust her would be to tell her the truth, even though it sounds utterly ridiculous. That would be how Genet would believe her. But, she may have also recognized something of a kindred spirit in Genet. I mean, obviously, like I said, she's frowned several times looking around Genet's operation. So I'm not saying that she trusts her or thinks she's a good person. But they are sort of connecting in the sense that they're both women who have been through a lot and have led people and have a little bit of deviousness about them. And I think Carol's just reading Genet really, really well here. So she tells her everything, and I was cracking up at the way that Carol mentioned Greenland. Ash was almost a sperm donor, and I was almost murdered by insane environmentalists. I could not stop laughing listening to the way she was describing it. But then came the really interesting part when Genet said, "Why are you looking for Daryl?" And Carol says, "I'm here to kill him." I was surprised when she said that. I was like, oh, that's good, Carol. I mean, like I said, she's manipulating Genet here and getting her to help Carol, But this is just classic Carol. She reads people and she's really good at this sort of thing. And that was super, super interesting. And I mean, she's thinking that it's working. Genet says that she's going to take her out there in the morning. And of course, Carol understands that Genet wants to get rid of these people. And she, you can just tell that she's figuring once she gets there, she'll like just sort of sneak away from Genet's people and find Daryl and that she'll figure it out. And I think Carol is envisioning something like Terminus. She'll get in there, she'll blow the place up, she'll find Daryl, it'll be okay. And obviously things get real before the end of the episode. But this particular scene was interesting because other than the line where she said she was there to kill Daryl, which is obviously not true, that was Carol being 100% real and honest and really herself. And it was just super interesting. I thought that scene between her and Genet was really, really interesting. Like I said, I just enjoyed watching this episode so much. So then we see Daryl being chained up in the shower stall, and they say he'll break in the morning, so they're obviously torturing him for information, and he's not willing to tell them where Laurent is. But then we get the next morning with Carol and Genet, and they stop at the Louvre. This is another interesting scene, and this one, it's interesting, I think, mostly as it relates to the theme and to Carol's internal arc. She tells Carol a little bit about working at the Louvre, and she mentions the Deluge painting, which I will look into a little bit more, but she calls the idea of having faith in a higher power a fantasy, and says that prayers didn't help us, not then, not now, and we do see one more flashback to the people who were trapped in the Louvre. And again, this is where we see Carol actually being the more hopeful of the two, and she says, well, everybody needs hope, and Genet says religion is not about religion is about control, not about hope. And she says that Losang's group is diluted by an opiate of hope. And it's interesting because you would almost think Carol being Carol would just agree with her, and she kind of does. Like, she talks to her back and forth and acts like she kind of understands what Genet is saying, but she still contradicts her. And that's actually kind of surprising, just because you would think even if Carol disagreed with her that she would agree with her in this case just to keep up appearances, But it's like, you can tell that this is not sitting well with Carol, and she's having a hard time keeping her mouth shut about it. So she just says something like, well, that it can turn into that, but, is implying that it doesn't always, and at the very bottom of things, I think Carol knows that if Daryl is with this group, they can't be that bad, otherwise Daryl wouldn't be with them. But it's still interesting to hear Carol defending faith and defending religion and religious people. And this is at least somewhat going back to season 2 again. So, we've had Sophia flashbacks and all of the season 2 of it all for Carol's internal arc. Because remember, in season 2, when Sophia went missing, Carol did go into the chapel, and she had a cross and was praying that she would be able to find Sophia. And I think when Sophia came out of the barn, that was kind of the end of Carol's faith, or it seemed like it was. She never really showed herself as very religious again. But as she grew up with religion, then at her core, she probably is, and she's just been really bitter about it because of the horrible reality of it all, since season 2. But you have to wonder if this is another sign, if she is returning to her faith a little bit, of her finally figuring out her demons, which started in season 2, and I've talked a lot about that in previous videos, right? Then there are some things that Genet, actually, she said these in the previous scene, which I meant to talk about them, like the night before, when Carol said she was going to kill Daryl, that scene. Genet just says these things. She says, the pains we women carry, we must let them go. Again, that's informing Carol's arc. She needs to let go of the past. And then she says, men seem to have no problem doing that. And Carol says, no, they do not. And again, I don't know that that's something Carol actually believes. She's just kind of agreeing with Genet because, we know from Daryl that he's not let go of the past entirely. And obviously men can carry trauma too. So this is just Genet. Anyway, the two of them are kind of bonding over this, but again, it's Carol just kind of agreeing with her so that she can get Genet's help in finding Daryl. And then Genet also says we have to forgive ourselves. And again, that very, very much applies to Carol needing to forgive herself over the past and over the death of the children she's been around. She obviously carries a lot of guilt for that, but in pretty much every case, it was not directly her fault, So it's just interesting. I can just see how they're informing her inner arc and how these themes are coming through. So anyway, super interesting stuff. So then we see Falou and Laurent at the cave, and of course neither Daryl or Isabelle has shown up, so they're worried. And we have another example of the line, "It's not on you," which is something that Rick originally said to Daryl about Beth. And we have heard it actually in at least one other episode this season. But here, Falou tells Laurent that, what Lo-Sang did, he took things way too far, and he says that's not on you to Laurent. So just another line that we've seen before. So then we have this scene with Daryl and Isabelle. I know that this is a scene that a lot of people are probably going to freak out about and not like. I mean, I liked it. I didn't mind it at all. And if anything, it just struck me as supremely tragic. It just seemed like such a sad scene, and it had a very melancholy feel to it. They bring Isabelle in, and he's upset that she's there. He thought she got away. And they chain her up in the stall next to Daryl, and she's acting like she's hurt. And I'm not saying she's not, that she's just acting that way. But again, it's kind of odd that they don't show us what happened to her. We don't know what happened or why she's hurt, and that's jumping out at me as odd. Almost like it could be a parallel to not seeing what happened with Beth, or not seeing, because Beth was not acting hurt in particular when she got to Grady, but she had the cast on her arm. Edwards told her she had a head wound, or a concussion. And we didn't see any of that. We didn't see her get put in the car. Most of us think she got hit by the car, but we didn't see it. And we didn't see what they treated her with. You know what I mean? It's just, and so that's kind of like, okay, well, we don't know what actually happened. What kind of wounds is Isabelle hiding? And she seems like she's really hurt. But we kind of have said that about Beth too. What is under her cast? Was she bitten? And I'll come back to that in just a minute. But she takes the lid off the shower drain. And it's broken, it's like jagged, and I could not figure out what she was doing at this part. And pretty much everything Daryl said, she would close her eyes as though she was really, really sad. And maybe that's because she's in pain, but I think it's more than that. She was acting very doomsday. I almost feel like she's already decided she's not going to survive. And so when I was watching it, I was wondering if maybe she was hiding a walker bite and maybe she's been bitten. And they certainly haven't showed us that, so that may not be the case. But then when she took the lid off the drain and it was jagged, I was going, is she going to cut her wrists again or something? What is she doing? It just seemed really odd to me that she's quiet and she talks to Daryl, but she's not super forthcoming. She's being like oddly just quiet and not really forthcoming about what happened. Like she's not telling him, okay, well, this is what happened and this is what, oh yeah, we'll make a plan. This is what we'll do. She's just really silent about things for the most part. And again, she's acting sad. Now, when Laurent comes in, when Lo-Sang comes in later to take her, he says, "You're obviously in pain." So I was going, okay, well, maybe it's just trying to show that she's in a lot of pain. But I don't think it's just that, though, because several things that Daryl says, because he says them, she closes her eyes and like furrows her brow as though she's really, really sad about what he's saying. So it's really kind of an odd scene. But of course she tells him to tell her a story because she wants to hear his voice, and he tells her about himself, like just a little story about him leaving home and not caring about anything. And then eventually he did. So here's the thing about this scene. I do think that this is a replay of the scene in Still on the porch. The way that they're both sitting is the giveaway to me, because even though they're back to back, which I'll explain why that's important in a minute, both of them are sitting up and have their knees drawn up and like their feet flat on the floor. And that is exactly how Beth and Daryl were both sitting on the porch in Alone. But of course, Beth and Daryl were facing each other, and these two are back to back, and they can't actually see one another. So I actually think that's on purpose. I think that this is a replay of the scene in Still, but it's sort of opposite because they can't see each other, which is probably just to signify that the fact that this isn't Beth and this isn't going to be his long-term love interest, but they're also still kind of doing the replay, and they're making it the opposite to show that, you know what I mean, that she's like sort of the opposite of Beth in some way. So I thought that was interesting. And then you can see another parallel in the fact that he tells the story, because during this part, he told her more than one story about him, but the one about Merle and the cartoon and the talking dog and all of that. So it's very, very similar. The other thing I thought about is that the story he tells her, he specifically says, he's talking about himself in the third person. It says, oh, there was a man, and then he left and found himself very far away from home, and then he says he didn't care about anything or anyone but himself. And then something changed. And, at first I was thinking, well, that was kind of true of Beth too. He could literally be saying that to Beth and it would be true. But the other thing too is that it's just true of Daryl in general. You could see this as Daryl talking about himself at the beginning of the series. And this is what he tells Beth too, that he was nobody and nothing, and he was just wandering around with Merle and didn't really care about anything, right? And what changed was that he met Rick's group. And then he started to care about people, and he started to understand what it was like to be part of a family and to actually look after people and, look after people other than himself. And so I think that this story informs things on a lot of levels. In the moment, he's literally talking about himself traveling to France and meeting Isabelle, but it also could be true of Beth. It also could be true of him since the beginning of the series. So that's what I mean when I say these are so interesting, these scenes. Everything they're saying, I'm seeing 7 different levels of how this is applying to the story. And it's just super interesting. Then she asks him to tell her about the fireflies again. So again, we have this firefly symbolism. And based on what's going to happen in episode 6, I'll probably have more to say about the symbolism then. But the big way that they connect it here is by having Daryl mention Tinkerbell, which is actually a very odd, in my opinion, thing for him to say. Number one, Daryl knows stuff about Disney fairies. That almost seems a little bit out of character for him. And just because Daryl is Daryl and he's so he's the kind of person that would think something like that is stupid. You know what I mean? He's not, he's not sentimental about movies and Disney things, So it's funny to me that the reference he uses is Tinkerbell's. And then Isabelle specifically said, because he wasn't sure if she would understand that reference, Isabelle specifically says, yeah, she saves Peter Pan. Okay, Peter Pan reference. Holy cow. I was like, okay, that is the most on-the-nose Peter Pan reference we have ever gotten. But we have gotten them before. Most recently, in season 1 of the Daryl Dixon spinoff, we saw the... and I'm not going to remember her name, the young woman who was running the school and taking care of all of the kids. There were definitely some Peter Pan references there with her kids being the Lost Boys and her being Wendy. And there were so many Beth parallels and so much Beth symbolism around her. There was also wolf symbolism around her. So that's important. But the other thing is, back in season 4, I'm not going to remember which episode, it was probably 2 or 3, Beth is singing to baby Judith, and it's when Michonne is in the cell and she's, exercising, doing sit-ups or something, but she had hurt her leg, remember, trying to leave the prison. And this was the part when Judith threw up, and so Beth gave her to Michonne so she could go change her shirt. It's that scene. Before that, Beth is singing a song about Peter Pan. Okay, so from season 4, the Peter Pan symbolism has been specifically around Beth. Okay, so not only is that still going, and can we now say that this is definitely related to Beth because they're doing Peter Pan symbolism, but this is yet another way that I'm going to jump up on my soapbox for just a minute and harp about the fact that there is no freaking way that they would just suddenly decide to kill off Beth in season 5, 1 episode before, because in season 4 they were doing Peter Pan symbolism. They already knew what her arc was going to be, and the symbolism for that arc is still going right now in this episode. Okay, you cannot get around that. It's simple fact. Go back and listen to that episode in season 4. She's talking about not wanting to grow up. It is a Peter Pan song about being one of the Lost Boys, going to Neverland, never wanting to grow up. And then we had the stuff last season, and now we're getting this, and her saying she saved Peter Pan, right? I think, I don't know that Daryl is necessarily supposed to be Peter Pan, maybe. You could see him as a perpetual kid, right? He definitely has some swashbuckling adventures. So we could go on and on about the Peter Pan symbolism, but that's really in-your-face symbolism, okay? Then we have the next interesting part of the scene where they touch hands, which I thought was sweet, and Isabelle says, "I love you." Now, I had to sit and think about this for a minute. First of all, I waited and I was wondering if he was going to say it back. He doesn't. I really thought that he might. And it wouldn't have bothered me too much if he did, but okay, there's about 5 different things I need to talk about with this. First of all, let's talk about the fact that he didn't. Inside the show, I was thinking about it, and it's just another thing, a lot like, I guess you could actually call it a lot like the dinner scene in Alone, in that they show us what the characters are doing, but we're not given what their thoughts are. So just like, in Alone, Daryl stares at her and Beth says, "Oh," and we can interpret that in certain ways that are kind of obvious, but at the same time, we don't know what's actually going through their heads or what they're actually thinking at that point. So that's why, number one, the people who didn't like that are coming back and going, well, you guys are making that up. They didn't actually say that. And, it's pretty obvious to most of us, and those people are mostly just in denial. But at the same time, we can't prove it because they're not telling us what's going on in their heads. So this is a lot like that, right? She says, "I love you." And it's like, okay, what is Daryl thinking? We kind of need to know what he's thinking in order to interpret his silence here. On the one hand, I'm not entirely sure he knows what "je t'aime" means. I mean, he's been there long enough to pick up some words and phrases, but he's not fluent. So does he actually know what that means? And whether he does or not would change the interpretation of him not saying anything, because if he does know, then he chose not to say it back to her, and that's just proof that he's not in love with her and decided not to say it back. If he doesn't know what it means, I kind of think Isabelle knows that he doesn't know what it means. So she said it knowing he wouldn't know what she was saying, and that's a choice on her part to not actually say that to him in a way he would understand it. So either way is really interesting, and I don't know which way it is because they're not telling us. So again, it's a little bit frustrating because we don't know even whether Daryl understood that or not. Maybe he did, but I don't know. So the other thing, and I know that I have an ask in my inbox about this. I apologize. I was going to try to do some more of your asks before this episode dropped, and I got busy. I wasn't able to. But there's another magazine. It's not. I hate calling it a magazine article. It's an article online, right? Where Norman talks about the kiss, and I have a few people who are asking me about it because he said that the kiss scene between Daryl and Isabelle last episode was an experiment. And I had people that are asking about that and what he meant by that, and does that mean that, Beth is not a thing? And no, I think all Norman was trying to say with that is simply that Daryl doesn't know where this relationship is going to go, and he's specifically telling us that Daryl is not in love with Isabelle. What he says in that article is that it's an experiment in Daryl's mind to see if this could turn into a viable relationship. So all he's trying to tell us is Daryl didn't kiss Isabelle because he's already in love with her. He kissed her because he's interested in maybe having a relationship with her. And, it's got to start somewhere. Like it's how all relationships go, right? You're interested in somebody, you're maybe a little bit attracted, you kiss them. The first kiss tells you a lot about the relationship. There's some people who kiss and go, no, not happening. I can just tell, it's not a thing. Or it could be the opposite of that, right? So it was just like a first kiss to start the relationship, but Norman is specifically telling us that he did not kiss her because he's in love with her. He kissed her as a way to start a relationship with her and see where it goes. And so the fact that she says she loves him here and he doesn't say it back may also, at least from the writer's standpoint, be trying to tell us that as well. So just really an interesting scene. But again, I just feel like Isabelle was so sad during the whole thing, and I don't know if they'll reveal something else that's going on here with her, but like I said, I thought maybe she'd been bitten. After seeing the preview for next week, I'm thinking that less, because in the preview for next week, it shows her talking to Losang, and she has the little jagged bit of the drain cover in her hand. So I was like, oh, okay, maybe she's going to try and kill Losang. That would make more sense anyway, why she took the drain cover. But at the same time, I still feel like either way, she has resigned herself to dying here. I don't think, even if she's not bitten, I feel like she's going to die taking out Losang, and she has just accepted that. You know what I mean? Just because maybe this was a foreshadow of what's going to happen, but the way she was acting was not hopeful and let's get out of here and let's go find Laurent. You know what I mean? She seemed like she was already accepting her own death, and that was kind of strange, but also just very, very sad. So anyway, very interesting scene. So then... Oh, one other thing, and you guys will have to tell me if this happened with you. When she first gets brought in, you know, when Daryl first sees Isabelle get brought in, I'm pretty sure she says, "I'm okay." But for some reason, my subtitles said, "look." And I don't know if the subtitles just didn't understand her with her French accent. And I wasn't really sure what to make of that. I was going, that's not what she said. But look isn't particularly... suspicious either. I don't know. Maybe it was just a messed up subtitle thing. But anyway, I made a note of that. So anyway, then we see Carol and Genet and all the others arrive at the nest. And Carol realizes, again, Carol's listening to them all speak French, but she speaks probably even less French than Daryl. So she doesn't really know what's going on. And she doesn't understand what Genet is saying. But remember how I said the guy at the beginning who was eating stuff off the floor and it was a foreshadow of the end? I mean, in terms of Genet, it's just showing that she really has no regard for human life, and even her own people, who you would argue she's a steward over. And, you know, if you compared her to Rick takes care of his people. She's willing to sacrifice them. She's willing to turn them into walkers to kill off these enemies, which obviously none of our good characters, none of our heroes would ever do that. But the guy who was eating the stew off the floor at the beginning, he's here at the end, and he's one of the ones that are going to be sacrificed. We could also have a little bit of a discussion about that, because she was in French. When she was speaking to them, she's not really lying to them about what's going to happen. She tells them that they are making a noble sacrifice, and they're all nodding their heads. So it sounds to me like they came to their deaths, you know, with their eyes open and understanding what would happen, and they're okay with that. So, was it last episode or either last episode or the first one, I mentioned that maybe I was actually talking about Losang's people, the fact that they're willing to turn on Daryl so easily and do what Losang says. You know, maybe they were a little bit like the village in Devon in Tales of the Walking Dead, in that they just are so suspicious about things that they're willing to change everything into a witch hunt at the drop of a hat. I don't know. In terms of Losang's people, some of them that's true of. Obviously, he has people that are loyal to him, but they also reiterate several times in this episode that the vast majority of people at the nest don't know what Losang is up to. They didn't know that he was going to have Laurent be bitten. And because he wasn't bitten, because Daryl stopped it, we don't actually know how people would have reacted to that. But that's exactly why Sylvie was running around trying to tell people that. So it could be that most of the people at the nest are not that way, and Losang just has people that are loyal to him. But now we have Genet's people, and they seem to be willing to die and become walkers because she's told them that it's noble, you know? So it's like, oh, okay, why would you do that? It becomes kind of an irony that Genet was dogging on organized religion and saying it's about control, and then she gets her own people to sacrifice their lives and become walkers to take out this other community. You know what I mean? It's like, okay, come on, Chica, you really don't see the irony here. But Carol does, and we realize that even though Carol thought she was kind of manipulating Genet, and, you know, she kind of was, but it's not working out as well as she thought. She is fully going to kill Carol and let Carol, you know, quote unquote, kill Daryl as a walker. So Carol just found herself in pretty deep crap here. So that's pretty much the end of the episode. But we do see in the preview for the next time that, you know, obviously Carol's not going to die, because we know that she's going to be in the next few episodes. So it'll be really interesting to see what happens. But this is very much looking like a replay of Terminus. Now, in that, Carol pretended to be dead and put walker gore all over her and walked in with the walkers. And I'm pretty sure that's what she's going to do here too. So, and then of course we know that eventually we're going to get, for those who have seen it, the leaked clips. We're going to get a Daryl and Carol reunion, which is very much like the reunion right after Terminus. So again, just very obvious that they're replaying things from season 4 and 5, and we're seeing a lot of that. Okay, so in terms of the episode Insider, I talked about, at the beginning we see Genet and the flashback at the Louvre, right? Isabelle talked about that and how that was very much the genesis of her character. And that's actually true of all of these characters. I mean, you could say just about every character in the show, who they become in the show is because they lost people when the turn first happened. So that's not really anything new. But interestingly, Isabelle talks about the baby. So remember how in season 1, we had her visiting people and she held that baby and was like really sweet with that baby. And it was funny because Isabelle goes, yeah, we've had questions about that. All the fans are going, what the crap was that about? Well, he tells us here, he says that the reason they did that scene in season 1 is because she was supposed to be thinking about the baby that she was never able to have with her husband. And so then I rewatched the scene at the beginning, wondering if they mentioned a baby at all. Like if she mentioned, I don't think she would have been pregnant because then we would have heard that she had a baby. But were they talking about her trying to get pregnant, or, were her and her husband, I don't know, setting up a nursery? I mean, they were talking about healthcare for France, so maybe that was a clue. But after watching it again, it really didn't mention anything about her having a baby or trying to get pregnant or anything like that. So that is actually not in the show, but the showrunner told us that she was thinking about the baby she was not able to have with her husband because she died. And what happened in that scene very much led to who she became later. So it's just interesting because, I mean, you could definitely say that about Carol too. Losing her daughter, even though Genet didn't actually have a baby, losing the children Carol has led to who she is. And, Daryl has not had children either, but he's been a father to people, and losing the people that he has led to who he is now. But of course the difference is that Genet is very ruthless and, to the point where she's willing to sacrifice people and doesn't have much regard for other human life and humanity, where Daryl and Carol do. So they become foils to each other in that they've all lost something. They all know what that's like. But who do you become after that, right? And that's a theme for the whole show. It is something we saw at Grady. But it's so great that The Walking Dead always does this with their villains. They'll show something that helps you to genuinely have compassion for Genet. I mean, it sucks what happened, right? She watched her husband die. She was very obviously traumatized by that and had a lot of grief. And then we see her with this baby, and that would be sweet and that would be sad. But then she's turning around and she's murdering all these people. And so it's just really great the way they make their villains so dynamic to where you feel something for them, but at the same time we can see that their choices in the here and now are not okay, and that's why, ultimately Daryl and Carol are going to kick some butt, and Genet will, I'm sure, not so much, right? So anyway, I just thought it was really interesting that they talked about that, and the thing is, it's just a whole big child and baby theme going on, because we've seen Daryl be father figure to other people like, Judith and RJ and Lydia and Henry. And of course we have Daryl now being a father to Laurent. We have Carol and the children she's lost. And now we have Genet and the baby, the fact that she wasn't able to have one. And, you know what I mean? It's just a whole big child and baby theme, which is really interesting. And if you're wondering how that ties into Beth, I mean, Beth was the one who took care of children, right? We have so many representations of that. Not only did she take care of baby Judith at the prison, but I've always thought it was really significant and symbolic that when the prison falls and she runs up behind Daryl, she says, I was looking for the kids to get them on the bus. She went looking for the children to help get them out. So that's something that she and Daryl always shared, is looking after the kids. They were both very concerned about newborn baby Judith, when she was born, and we see them both really hovering over the baby when Daryl brings back the formula. I mean, it's just always been a theme. And then we've seen a lot of child and baby symbolism tied up with Beth's symbolism, even when she wasn't there. So there was a lot of it around Denise. We had the one with Jocelyn, Michonne's friend, that I always thought was an anti-parallel to Beth. And And then, of course, we have the gal from season 1 of Daryl Dixon with the school and the children that had all that Beth symbolism around her. So anyway, this is going to continue, and Beth will be part of the child and baby theme. She always has been. So it was just really interesting to see it in this context and to hear the showrunner talk about it at the end and how Genet was part of this baby theme, even though we didn't actually hear a baby talked about for Genet in the show. So that's also maybe another way of showing that when they want us to know something, they will tell us outside of the show. I've said this a million times. What they show in the episodes is obviously very important, but if there's something they want to get across to us that they weren't able to put in the episode for some reason, they will tell us pretty directly outside of the show. So that's important to remember. That's why we always put a lot of significance in what the showrunners say and interviews and what's coming out in articles and what's being posted on official social media channels, because they do think about this stuff and they are very, very intentional about it. The other theme I thought was just the I love you theme. Now maybe this seems obvious, but in the very beginning scene with Genet and her husband, we hear them and see them say I love you to each other. And, you know, not shocking given that they are married, but if you think about it logically, it almost shows that they were very worried about what was happening, because at that point they hadn't seen any of the zombies yet, right? None of the walkers had come up, and this was the first time it had happened, so nobody knew they were there until they started to see them. But both of them, you know, put their hand on the glass and say, I love you. And, you know, granted, it's a kind of a tense thing because they're being kept from each other, so maybe it's not shocking that you would say that in that situation. But I guess my point is that when we've seen other people in the past, they don't always specifically have them look at each other and say, I love you. It's implied because, you know, it's somebody losing a wife or a husband or a boyfriend or a child, or, you know, but we don't always hear them say that. That was a very intentional choice to put that in. And then by the end, with Daryl and Isabelle, we hear her say that to him, but we very specifically don't hear him say it to her. You see what I mean? So there's a theme about saying I love you, and at least with Genet and, well, no, in both cases it's about romantic love, so it's not like a parent saying this to a child. But then there's also the contrast of both of them saying it in Genet and her husband's case, and only one of them saying it in Daryl and Isabelle's case. So make of that what you will. You could go a lot of different ways with it, but I thought it was really interesting. I probably say that too often. Really, really interesting, guys. Really interesting. Okay. So that is all of the notes I have right now. Again, I'm sure we'll find more as the week goes on, and I will get to some more of your asks so we can go over things, but I really liked this episode. It was just, again, it was so well written. It was so interesting to watch, and I had to sit and think about it for a long time because there's a lot of stuff to contemplate here, even though we didn't have any massive plot events other than that, you know, they did the ceremony finally, and, you know, they were able to stop it so Laurent didn't get bitten. But, you know, other than that, there wasn't anything massively that did happen. All of that seems to be coming in the next episode, and I will tell you that having seen a lot of the spoiler clips, season 4, I mean, all the things are going down in season 4, or I mean, I keep saying season, I'm sorry, episode 4. There's massive things that go down in episode 4, so that will be something to look forward to. But yeah, let me know what you guys thought about it. Again, I really loved this episode. I thought it was fantastic, and I hope you guys did too, and I will be back soon with more. Bye!